G'day friends and fans, welcome to Dave Talks of Ukraine War Update for the 13th of November 2025. I'm your host, the author David Applegate, author of the books The Boyhood of Cade, Power Games, Into the Earthbound, The Erotic Tales from the Empire, Part 1, out now, Part 2 coming soon. Thank you all. This is Sport Channel. You can support your channel through Patreon and other links in my link tree. Alright. Russia has launched approximately 138 drone and missile strikes. Oh, a missile strike according to the Ukrainian Air Forces. Mostly along the coast, probably aimed at drone boats, as the Russians have reported to have destroyed 8. Including some cranes and shipping containers, possible missile strike on the docks themselves in Odessa, successful missile strike. Though the Ukrainian Air Force also claims to have shot a lot of them down. Well, the missile got through. As we go around the map, we have successful drone strikes on Sumy. We have fighting in the buffer zone. Now, the buffer zone along the north is sporadic and has barely moved in a couple of years. Though for a long time it was focused on Kursk. The Russians have renewed their offensive operations after announcing cleanup in Kupiansk has ceased, and they now also have renewed fighting in other parts and continued fighting, though they've made no progress. Again, renewed fighting in parts north of Lyman, no progress. We're renewed fighting around Seversk with no progress. Very little progress, if any at all. And Konsk, probably would say it actually looks like only a little bit down here and that's it. But a little bit is what they do every day. And eventually you'll see an update to the map where they're probably up this road, have taken this area. Though the Ukrainians have slowed them down for some time now. You've seen they've made breakthroughs in other... It has... See, when the Ukrainians hold back the Russian army, it's often at the expense of other territories. Now there's renewed fighting reported in Pokrovsk, but the Ukrainians haven't reported it. But there is fighting, well, they say western Pokrovsk. I think it's actually down here. So, but there's renewed fighting in the north with no progress. Renewed fighting as we head further west, no progress. Now we come down to here. There is progress north of Hulam. As I said, the Russians broke through, and as I said, they're coming for Huli. They made that obvious now. But they are also coming from Orsk again. Orsk has held out for years. Huli could hold out. But it will come at the cost of other territories. Ukraine, despite having numerical superiority on the battlefield, does not have logistical or reserves that Russia can draw upon to refresh its troops, as well as the numerous equipment and the broader range, as well as the obvious tactical advantage that their air defences are superior. In World War II, superior air defences and a superior air force, particularly in bombing raids, is what did it for the Allies. While on the Russian front, it was the numerical superiority of tanks. Now here again, it is somewhat the numerical superiority, however, it shifted from tanks, which were very successful in 2022, to drones, making tanks far more vulnerable, far less impactful as anything other than mobile artillery, to able to conduct rapid assaults. But in the long term, you will not probably see a Russian offensive like 2022 again, simply because drones and missiles are far more numerous now. But what we see, of course, is the Russian tactical advantage, and that is how they target the Ukrainians. Now, we'll get to that later, and I'll show you some footage that explains it and shows it better. But we now see that the Ukrainians have brought in overland vehicles to evacuate the wounded from Pokrovsk. Kosk. Sorry. I thought it was Pokrovsk. No. There were evacuations from Pokrovsk earlier today. The Russians have lulls in the fighting due to the weather. As you can see, the sky is grey, it is foggy. The same fog that enabled the Russians to rush into Pokrovsk is now bringing a cold snap that is keeping most of the fighting confined to the few daylight hours. Because night vision equipment is no good in the fog. Sure, it's good when you know where you're going. You know, you'll race in and occupy empty buildings, highlighted by drones, but that's about it. Now, EU is running out of money, and the way they're telling you this is they can no longer fund the Ukraine war to the end of the year. This year, they cannot come up with the promised money for December unless they rob the Russians. Now, this was warned about in October. Belgium has refused to back the initiative that robs the Russian assets and to use them as guarantees against financial loans, and then they plan to let Ukraine default on those loans so the EU can then seize the Russian assets. They know Ukraine is going to default on their loans. Now, the Ukraine may actually get their budget through to February, but that's about it. But other reports, including the Financial Times, says 140 billion in loans called reparations. Now, apparently, it's clear that without this, the EU funding will collapse. But the European Union and Italian government is deeply concerned about Russia having spent money on soft power, talking about infrastructure strikes. But NATO, right, provides certain weapons, including the Storm Shadow, which can only be guided by certain military satellites which belong to NATO. And as far as Russia concerns, those are NATO strikes launched by Ukraine. This is a proxy war. And other countries have, though I don't know how it will impact going forward, because there's conflicting reports. What would happen? Belgium is worried about the backlash from the financial markets, that if the EU is in the business of stealing Russian assets today, how will Russia retaliate? How will it impact the war? What retaliation will Russia take out on the former Soviet Republic? They are certain that destroying relationships with Russia for the next 100 years is beyond reparations, right? That, Europe shouldn't have got involved. There are many now who believe Europe shouldn't have got involved with the conflict, other than pulling the two parties apart in 2022 and settling the matter in the Court of Arbitration. But this is what they face. By their own rules, according to many legal experts, if Europe was taken to their own Court of Arbitration by Russia, that Europe would lose. And they're worried about more investments pulling out of Europe for the United States, including Europeans who say, what happens with Iraq? What happens? How are we going to make peace with anybody in the future if we steal from Russia today? Nobody's going to trust us. All right? That they'll just rob the Russians of money under the guise of a loan, give it to a third party. So Saudi Arabia, Iran, we don't like you. We'll rob your assets. We'll put loans against them. We'll give the money to Saudi Arabia, and when they default on the loan, we'll take the assets. Now, Saudi Arabia isn't likely to default on the loan, but they might, just to spite Iran, to buy those assets with the borrowed money cheaper. See how it becomes a nightmare? And what happens with Mexico or Brazil, many countries have stated they'll pull out of Europe and stop trading with Europe. Now, Europe only has 20 to 30% of its trade with the United States. Most countries are dependent on most countries have already suffered because of a loss of 30% of world trade. The ceasing of trade with Russia has cost Europe 30% of its exports. That's why Europe is in financial trouble. They won't admit it. They're too proud. This is the problem with liberalism. It's the cope and the lies. I will just make it up with trade elsewhere. But most of the world doesn't even Europe doesn't consume enough to make up for that loss. This cope that you can make it all up everywhere and elsewhere and just shift trade like it's, just snap the fingers and we got another $1 billion trade deal. No. Politico, however, has pointed out the situation on the battlefield is going to take a turn for the worst. This is the most dangerous winter since 2022. Now, the Russians last year didn't launch as much of an offensive as I thought they would, but this year it's looking big. Now, we do have new anti-drone equipment on the battlefield, particularly in the form of detection and countermeasures. So they have radar and jamming, as well as targeted electronic warfare devices. Russia is stringing out what they call a signal post. These are radar and microwave detectors all across the frontier, as they call it now. They're ringing Moscow with air defenses. They are working to plug holes in their systems. Now, the Ukrainian forces are facing a shortage. Now, according to Politico, they're claiming Russian troops outnumber Ukrainian forces as much as 10 to 1 in some sectors. But again, in some sectors, the Russians are not advancing on purpose. Okay? Russia is not pushing its luck. They know that there are 110,000 Polish and Romanian troops who've been prepared for the last year and a half with French and some Italians and Germans, and probably UK as well, to go in as a stabilization force. The Russians keep saying that NATO is on the edge of declaring war, and it should be taken seriously. Now, just because they say 10 to 1 in some areas doesn't mean all areas. And I would suggest that this is only in minor pockets, right? You'll say that Ukraine's left some territorial guards, but in areas like Konsk and other areas that are holding out well, that's where the Ukrainians are concentrating their forces, whereas, say, Pavlovsk, there ain't much left there. But overall, right, it's estimated 840,000 Ukrainian troops, 670,000 Russian troops. They are in the middle of rotation, but they are successfully rotating their troops while they are keeping by reinforcing their front line with their second line and bringing their third line up, while those coming off the front lines are meeting with those coming to the front lines to make up the third line. And out of the third line, those who meet their obligations will leave or renew, while those replacements are trained and dispersed amongst the second line. The third line's mostly logistical and training, combat training. Most Russian troops will spend anywhere from a month to 3 months there. They'll spend a couple more on the second line. It's the same with Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't have many on their second line. They have most on their front line. And again, it says in some frontline sectors, whereas the Ukrainians on the third line are very thin. They're mostly vehicles conducting hit-and-run artillery attacks, often only with long-range mortars from Italy. Now, this doesn't mean the Ukrainians can be pushed back all at once, right? The Russians do not outnumber the Ukrainians in most areas. They only outnumber them where they're conducting their thrusts. And once they've conducted their thrust, a lot of those assault troops are sent back to the third line. It is dynamic, okay? You can spend 6 to 8 weeks on the front line. You can spend a week. It all depends what happens. If you get shot, you're not there for long. If you don't get shot, not much happens. You can be there for a full 8 weeks before you're sent on leave. And most leave is only the third line. There isn't these. This isn't America in Vietnam where people have sent, to Saigon for R&R and they disappear for 3 months, No offense to those who didn't, but there's a lot of bad things there was a lot of mismanagement of that war, and you're not finding that here. Not from the Ukrainians, although they are having discipline problems where most of their troops are slow to react and only react when they're under direct threat from the Russians. They're finding it very hard to order counteroffensives because they've seen what happens 24 hours later, that the fighting stops and they think, hurrah, we've won. And then a month later, they find out all their comrades they go to the flag lowering ceremony for their comrades. And that's the problem. More and more, it's spreading like wildfire that an offensive is a death sentence in Ukraine. And for the Russians, they are reluctant to engage in offensives because each offensive could be walking into an artillery trap. So they are taking their time and they're sussing out every angle, and they are probing and assaulting and withdrawing many, many times before they commit. This has Zelensky worried because his Western backers are divided, with some now talking about leaving, while parts of Europe have greatly benefited from Russian sanctions, in that now Europe wanting to take the lead, go ahead. They are allegedly now buying up Lukoil and Rostov's holdings. So much for stealing their assets. It looks like a Swiss energy-based trader was going to buy them, though the US Treasury Department claims they had ties to the Russian government. But they are running out of things, so-called shadow fleets or shadow companies to sell their assets to. But these assets are held by Euroclear. They blocked the proposal. Belgium, however, is only doing this to try and push $140 billion. Now, what would happen, $140 billion, right, when you're spending $200 billion a year on Ukraine, you're outspending Russia. Ukraine will take 1.6 to 2.8 trillion to rebuild. What happens if Russia decides to decimate $140 billion in assets across Ukraine? Decimate them. Instead of damaging power stations, they decimate them. They have decimated stations before. They have completely annihilated several power stations in the past. A couple of Orsk's will completely annihilate each power station. So 2 missiles to how many power stations have got? 20, 30? 20, 30. Half their power stations. What are you going to do then? When you're going to lose far more than that as Ukraine dies. Ukrainians aren't going to sit around. They'll flee. They won't. The border guards won't stop them. The border guards will have already left. Why would the border guards care about the Ukrainian government when they've got no power? Literally no electricity. And this is just one of many scenarios. What if they start sinking ships as they come through the... What if the Russians start blockading the ships coming coming towards Ukraine, turning them back, forcing them into Romanian ports, just forcing them to up the cost of shipping anything and everything in and out of Ukraine? In many ways, Russia can hurt you back. You just do not seem to understand, Mr. I think it's not Marco Rubio. I should mean Ursula von der Leyen. But I don't think Ursula is the one behind this. I think this is Mark Rutte taking out his anger and frustration on the Russians, because they have embarrassed him in the past, particularly pointing, pointing out his corruption, holding on to power in the Netherlands, even though he lost the election. There's nothing like an angry European bureaucrat to abuse power, right? But will Zelensky survive this? We don't know. The corruption scandal is extremely unfortunate, according to top diplomats. And following revelations that Zelensky himself has extorted millions of dollars from the Ukrainian power sector, that the investigations have evolved that there's over 100 million in kickbacks. So the billions that you have sent to Ukraine have been siphoned off by Zelensky and others, all of whom have not ended this war, because it means an end to the gravy train. Kickbacks and embezzlement. Because if they join the European Commission has repeatedly instructed Ukraine to expand its anti-corruption legislation as part of its EU bid, deal with the corrupt, but Ukraine claims that this is alleged unacceptable, vows to sanction the individuals implicated. But of course, Zelensky, will he survive? Of course he will. They won't take him out. They are too proud. They won't admit it was Zelensky. They'll take out his top aide or someone. This is a setup to take out the top aide, who's been recently very critical of Zelensky and may have been the whistleblower against Zelensky, even though his top aide was also implicated. This could be tit for tat. I call the pot calling the kettle black. One of them is lying, or they're both trying to save their own skin by sinking the other. But rampant corruption in Ukraine is seemingly obvious, according to Dmitry Peskov, and asked whether or not there's going to be a large-scale investigation. Of course there won't be. Right? The regime has long been protected. The NBU and Anti-Corruption Office only serve at the leisure of the president, despite all the promises. Otherwise, they're stripped of their independence. Their independence has only been returned in lip service. According to the Russians, there is no action being taken, despite mass protests in Ukraine, that multiple Western backers have threatened but never done anything to force Zelensky to reverse his decision, even though they allegedly have threatened Kiev and threatened him to make statements about reversing his position. The Office of Corruption in Ukraine, the Prosecutor General, is still having to deal with the fact that military intelligence is monitoring everything they do and reporting everything they do to Zelensky. So they're not independent because they cannot operate in secrecy. So they can't investigate Zelensky. So every time they get close to the corruption, someone gets thrown under the bus. And there's always someone linked to Zelensky. Because everybody in the Zelensky government are hand appointed by Zelensky. Yet they're all turning out to be corrupt. Know thy leaders by their associates. Which is why Trump is quick to drop people who don't live up to expectation. Which is also what's going on in Keir Starmer's cabinet. He's desperate to try and find somebody to throw under the bus to save his foreign secretary, his defense minister, and many others who have all been swept up in corruption scandals. How many in Switzerland? How many in Germany? How many in France? How many in Brussels? Most of the French government is corrupt. I won't talk about bureaucrats here and the cabinet, but you know, they threw Sarkozy under the bus allegedly over campaign financing, and apparently it's one of these subjective rules which you can spend money in several ways on your campaign, but if they feel like this fundraiser wasn't a campaign or a personal party, which often happens, I think Sarkozy fell for a trap for his own. That it's always tempting, you know, to throw a thank you party to you, because the fundraisers, everybody says, oh, you owe us, you owe us, you owe us. I've been there in the fundraising business. I know the pressures that these morons bring to bear. The rules are subjective. Don't worry about it. You know, no, don't ever. Whenever someone says the rules are subjective, that's a trap, okay? They're trying to trap you so they can control you. Now, the Russian forces are right now engaged in a second offensive in Pavlovsk. The first ended 22 hours ago. They started a new offensive. This probably freshly arrived troops with grads, new supply of rockets. Additionally, they repelled counterattacks. Now, this is yesterday, they destroyed 22 pieces of equipment, including 12 armoured vehicles. This is just in Pavlovsk. Mostly, unfortunately, 250 Ukrainians have been eliminated. This is what they say, dead. Okay, it's on top of the 1,000-something wounded in Pavlovsk. Pavlovsk is the largest single-day casualty for the Ukrainians since the fall of Bakhmut. However, it's not the only offensive. This is the small town of Vochask, where the Ukrainians are under siege from drones as they come through town to supply other areas. This is on the way. Despite jamming, the drones are coming through. Now and again, the Ukrainians come under heavy artillery, but you'll notice one thing. There's no counter batteries. They're attacking Ukrainian trench lines through north of the town. You can see they highlight them, telling you exactly where they are in the Ukrainian forest. You can see now and again they hit something. There's a secondary flash. They're firing probably 105 high explosives, although they could be long range. They look a little small for 153, but they are hitting some now and again. But you can see they've hit this area off and on. And are using the drones to justify unchallenged. There is no counter battery. There is no drones over Ukraine unchallenged. Where are the IRIS-Ts that the Germans sent? Probably dead. Day before yesterday, they were talking about the Grant anti-aircraft guns. Where are they? They're around Odessa, they're around Kiev. This is where I really think they are. I don't think over 100 IRIS-Ts were shot down or blown up. I don't think they're on the front lines. I think there's very few air defences on the front lines. I think the Zelensky regime is putting them on themselves and protecting themselves. They are not doing enough. They are deliberately allowing the slaughter of Ukrainians to try and trigger World War III so Zelensky can have his crusade against Russia. Although he said Russia and China, I don't think he'll get his crusade against China. I think Xi will back down very soon, and there's been very indications from the Chinese Foreign Ministry that they'll work with the Americans under certain conditions to end the Ukraine war, which is obviously same with India. I think India and China are using the Ukraine war there as a leverage against the United States and Europe for concessions to get particularly also leverage against Russia to get oil at a discount. If someone had the audacity to stand up to Europe and kick them all in the collective hiney and tell them to get out of their own stupidity and their own Russophobia, but they're too busy wanting to steal the Russian assets, using Ukraine as a proxy to hurt Russia, because they can't expand their own portfolios legally. Okay, they can't legally. This has happened before, where the Europeans overspend, overpromise, overprice, underdeliver, and then try to hit you up for massive prices on advanced technology, which then is undercut by immediately turning around and having it mass produced in China and then selling off assets to China to line their own pockets for short-term gain. And now they want to buy them back from China and Russia, and they can't without some sort of pretext, because they can't, despite the fact that some of these companies have collapsed, they just transfer them to the state ownership. So it's a forever mess that Europe has got itself into by embracing the common market. You keep hearing people in Europe complaining about bring back the common market. The common market died 20 years ago, you idiots. And this is the result, okay? You have Europe wanting to buy Ukraine, buying Poland, buying Romania, buying Lithuania, buying Estonia. Well, the bills come due. They've bought off the Serbian government, but the bills come due and they can't keep up with their promises. And the only state that so far truly benefited has been the increase, the increase in filming in Romania has done them well. Hungary's pulled itself by its bootstraps, but the real winner, third state, is Poland. They're the real winners, right? Everybody else is just doing fine, but who's doing dandy is Poland. But Romania's doing okay, but they're in trouble. But they can get out of that. So could Hungary. They can get out of it. It's just short-term, filming in Romania is going to increase. So I think European Union, however, they're going to not go well. But the problem with Romania is they're facing being the front line. They don't want to be the front line. But right now, it has many people worried about filming in Romania if war breaks out. But Romania still strong for now. They've been able to convince people that war won't break out. So doesn't it tell you something? All right? While everybody's talking about war, Romania's the only one who's saying to its investors and partners that there's going to be no war, which means Ursula von der Leyen is trying to leverage with vaporware. Okay, she is destructive, and yet because the European bureaucrats control the elections, control the pension funds, the unions tell people that if they don't vote for the EU, their pension funds will disappear. Which means their pension funds have disappeared and the state's just propping them up. When the government tells you things are good, but no, the but has already happened. The things are only good because they're running up the debt, Obama. Of course, they always blame Trump, but that was COVID, which was engineered by China. But for some reason, Europe wants to take out their anger and frustrations on Russia because they can't stand up to China. This is called displacement. It's like projection, except instead of projecting your worst traits onto someone else, you project your anger and engage in violence against a weaker opponent because you can't take on their strong opponent. It usually happens in school where you get a group of fraidy cats, the people who are so insecure in themselves, ganging up in small gangs, usually, and engage in violence against smaller or against individuals as a group because they can't take on the tougher kids. So you get that. So they become the sock puppets of and you can tell in school, that later on in life, these people become criminals, right? If you don't crack down on them in school, yet this is what schools do all the time. They let the bullies run riot because the pecking order creates the next round of politicians. And sports does. This is a known fact, okay? Most of to escape violence in schools, most of the people who engage in violence, the strong individuals go into the military, or police, but whereas the more sinister violent drawn into organised crime or either as a politician or as a criminal. This is a known fact, but psychology doesn't put the rules of life into a book. Well, actually someone did back in the Roman Empire, the Book of Power, but since then it is not something that is widely discussed or widely accepted because to speak about the rules publicly breaks the rules, okay? Machiavelli, I think, actually was the last one to put the rules of power, put pen to paper for the rules of power, but it is well known, okay, in psychological circles that projection and displacement go on all the time. Usually, however, these politicians, right, usually fail. But the problem is we have in Europe an entrenched system. Unions have become... unions and bureaucracy are hand in hand entrenched power. That means if you're looking for entrenched racism and entrenched corruption, it's unionized. So how are the left going to fight systemic corruption when they are the corruption? It's the same as Zelensky in Ukraine. How are you going to fight systemic corruption when everybody is handpicked by him and his spies watch and listen to everything the secret police do, and then the secret police and the anti-corruption body are monitored by another secret police who report directly to Zelensky? So you have the SBU, the Office of Presidential Security Force, whatever, British intelligence, let's face it, and that's a huge problem that nothing can be done in Ukraine because the Ukrainian government has no secrets from the outside world, whether it's from Russia or the British or just from Zelensky and his backers who are in Switzerland. Now, I thought these Swiss backers were actually, now they've been reported as pro-Russian, but I don't think so. I think, if they are, then I think this is what I've suspected all along, that Zelensky and Russia have been played by the same side, that they're actually not pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian, they're Chinese. That's why we cannot learn who Kremlinski's partners are, or these mysterious oil barons who want to buy, because there aren't that many oil barons in the world who are not Saudi. Okay, there aren't that many rich oil barons who aren't Saudi. Okay, there's American. All right, there's only there's 9 Ukrainian billionaires. All right, there's something like 540 Chinese. There's something like another lot of Indians again. But most of them are in the US, and most of them aren't in oil. Like the top 100 in the energy sector are all well-known people. So there can't be a mysterious oil baron unless they don't want to name him, which means most likely it is one of the 9 Chinese, right, who are extraordinarily wealthy, stateless men who do live in Switzerland, who do have control of various oil interests around the world, including large refineries. There are 9 of them, oddly enough, in private refineries in China, still operating. And this board also runs the Chinese state conglomerate. And this is why I believe the Ukraine war won't come to an end until you address 3 issues: the Ukrainian billionaires, the corruption of the EU state, and the corruption of the Ukrainian state. So Trump has to bring pressure on China and to India, so because India is a recipient, they're buying the Russian oil through the Luloft conglomerate, right, which is a Russian billionaire who ain't in Russia, okay, and no matter how many times these foreign Russians denounce Putin, they still get bashed around by the British state, because the British state has to take out its anger and frustration on these men because they can't, and the same with Russia, they take out their anger and frustration on Russia because they are little men with little men syndrome, okay. Before Napoleon, the British invented little man syndrome. And then, of course, they project that on Napoleon, although he had little man syndrome. And before that, it was Caesar, 5'8", although, and eventually, we don't know if Caesar was corrupt or it was just Brutus biding his time all along. We don't know the fact. We do know that Brutus did turn on Caesar. We do know that this is not the first or last time a general has turned on. The Roman Empire was full of betrayals, and we're looking at Ukraine now, and we're just waiting for that shoe to drop and see history repeat, where Ukrainian generals will get sick and tired of being replaced by Zelensky with yet another yes man who will launch offensives, get tens of thousands killed, then resign and be replaced again by the former commanders who were at least competent in holding back the Russians. So that's where Ukraine is at. Ukrainians, and Europeans in general, and the Slavic people in general, and the Nordic and the Celtic and the Roman and the Greek and the Angles and the Saxons all have a common enemy, and that is the bureaucratic state, which includes the millionaires and billionaires who profit from that bureaucratic state. That's not to say that all billionaires are our enemy, but every time you hear complaints about millionaires and billionaires from the left, it's always those who are benefiting the most from state enterprises, which I would include Amazon, Microsoft, and many others in that, who aren't ideologically aligned perfectly with everything they want, because ultimately they want to control that bureaucratic state and the crony capitalism is just a means to an end to get you used to public enterprises, and then they will take them over in the so-called Mandami revolution, which ain't going to happen, by the way. They've already said they'll close their businesses. New Yorkers will have to buy their food from delivery services. That'll send the cost of living through the roof and create food deserts, because those state enterprises will go bankrupt. Okay, look up Sunshine in Ohio. Look up what's happened in California with the food banks there. They're all bankrupt. Every time they open a food bank, it's swarmed by people. Everything's gone within a day. They don't last. They're budgeted for a month and they don't last a day. They don't make it to the next month because the corruption is just enormous. The staff take all the food home. If you haven't figured that out, what happens? And this is what's happening in Ukraine with food. Why everything's scarce. And why they won't talk about Ukraine and what really is going on in Ukraine. And why it's so important to share these videos. Get more eyeballs on this. I think until the sunlight is shined on Ukraine and breaks through the fog of war, pun intended, you will not see an end to this war. I think Britain is too unstable right now to do anything, but France and Germany, and Poland, if the people there who oppose the war get more organised and get more vocal weekly, daily, please get the voices heard. Like, share and subscribe. Please support the channel. Support me on Ko-Fi, Patreon, buy my books, buy my merch. All my links are in the link tree, description below, in my profile. Scan the QR code on the screen right now. Thank you. Appreciate each and every one of you. See you in the next video, and bye for now.